Welcome. In this video, we're going to be looking at a paper by this philosopher right here, Marion Young, and her paper, Five Faces of Oppression. This paper is now considered to be something of a classic in social and political philosophy. Many philosophers will cite it, and it's been cited in thousands of other papers. It's been taught in thousands of other classes. So we're going to look at it as a way into thinking about the nature of what we're talking about when we talk about the nature of oppression. And we can also sort of look at it as a way of how our talk about oppression has changed in the contemporary culture. Maybe with a little bit more lean towards the way that Young is thinking about it than the old way that she's thinking about it. So here's what we're going to do in the paper. We're going to follow the steps that Marion Young takes us on. So we're going to look at the old way of thinking about oppression and her way of thinking about oppression that she was seeing within the realm of social activism in her time. And then we're going to walk through and explain and understand some examples of each of the five faces of oppression. So, exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. These are the five faces of oppression that Young notices. And then we'll sum up. We'll see how we can understand the nature of injustice and what we're fighting against when we fight for a better future, according to Young. And that'll be the plan. And hopefully by the end of this video, we will together have worked up a clear understanding of how Young wants to think about oppression. So, first idea is just that the concept of oppression has changed, right? The traditional view will tell us something like this. Oppression is the sort of thing that is undertaken and performed by tyrants, right? So when you have a particular individual ruling over society in a way that is harmful, disrespectful of human rights, and violent, you might think of that as your paradigm case of oppression. You know, you might think about Stalin sending people off to work camps, right? We have a particular tyrant, and in each case of him sending somebody to a work camp, that would be oppression. That is part of our common talk about oppression, but Young says that when she looks at how the concept is being understood, talked about, and revised within what she calls the New Left, and here I think that she's talking about activist circles for, say, gay and lesbian people, black folks, Latinx folks. They think about oppression in a way that is slightly different from this paradigm of the tyrannical ruler behaving cruelly towards their subjects. The first idea that she wants to advance is this notion that instead of thinking about a particular tyrannical individual and a particular victim, we can think about oppression in terms of groups. So instead of seeing particular black folks as being the victim of tyrannical rule, we might think of black people or the black community as the victims of oppression in certain cases. Or instead of thinking about particular women as victims of the patriarchy, we might think of women in general as victims of the patriarchy. And the way that she's thinking about it, we don't want to think about groups just as a mere aggregate. When we think about an aggregate, we're thinking about just a conceptually defined group that is classed together on the basis of a certain characteristic. So, you know, we wouldn't want to just think of women as being classed as those who identify as women or those who have XX chromosomes or whatever else. that would be to just aggregate them together and say that that is a similarity. It might be relevant or it might not be, because we could also think about the aggregate of people who are exactly 5'9", or the aggregate of people who were born on Tuesdays. These are groups of a sort, but they are not all that interesting in terms of social analysis, Young seems to think. She also says that we don't want to think about groups as associations. An association is something that you join voluntarily and officially. So, for instance, to be a member of a political party is something that you would sign up for. That would be to be part of an association. The way that Young is thinking about it is that neither of these classes, the aggregate or the association, really captures what it is to be a member of a certain social group. That you're not simply an arbitrary class of people or a voluntary organization when you think about what it is to have a race or a sexual orientation. Right? So we're thinking about groups, and moreover, some groups can be oppressed by other groups. So we would think about, in a patriarchal society, how men can be oppressing women. And in this way, we would think about the way that men as a social group enjoy certain benefits and are entitled to certain things and are treated in a certain way. They're given certain social status above women. And in this way, we would think of that relationship of the groups as a form of oppression that we need to work to fight against, that we need to change. Right? So the way that Young is thinking about oppression, she says, we're thinking about the vast and deep injustices some groups suffer as the consequence of frequently unconscious assumptions and reactions of well-meaning people in ordinary interactions. Media and cultural stereotypes and structural features of bureaucratic hierarchy and market mechanisms. In short, the normal processes of everyday life. So what's very interesting here is that instead of having an evil, malicious oppressor, according to Young, we can instead understand oppression through the structures of how society is set up. So, we could think about the ways, to stick with the example, of how well-meaning people can perpetuate a patriarchal society. And this might be through things like placing certain expectations on people about what a good woman might be, or the ways in which our society is set up. So we could think about bureaucratic mechanisms that fail to give adequate support to, say, birthing parents, right? These are ways in which the normal processes of ordinary life that we expect a person to be back at work 6 weeks after giving birth to a baby, well, these are some of the ways in which we can find patriarchy in society. Nobody's out to hurt anybody, but the way that we've shaped and structured our society can give rise to serious injustices. So what Young then wants to do is say, well, not only can we understand the way that groups relate to one another in terms of these structural social injustices, but there are different ways in which one group can be oppressing another group. And this is how she's going to get us to the 5 faces of oppression. The way that Young is thinking about it is that these 5 dimensions of oppression capture the sort of problem that activists in the New Left are interested in, worried about, that they're concerned to change. And Young is going to say that these 5 faces of oppression, these 5 categories of problem, can be intermixed. None of them takes more priority over the other, but we can use each of these categories, these faces, as a way into recognizing and understanding oppression. So let's look through these 5 faces. The first face of oppression that Young sees is what she calls exploitation. In the political philosophy course that this series of videos is building, we've already looked at this notion of exploitation through the work of Karl Marx and the analysis of Marx that we got from Alan Wood. And here's how Young puts the notion of oppression. She says that when we think about oppression through exploitation, the central insight expressed then is that domination occurs through the steady process of the transfer of the results of the labor of some people to benefit others. Right? So she then gives some examples. Right? So we have a Marxist idea. If we think back to Value, Price, Profit by Marx, his idea was that capitalists can exploit labor by generating profits. And how do they generate profits? Well, they sell commodities with value added to them. And the value added to those commodities is done through wage labor. Right? So let's say these wage laborers are adding $100 in value to these commodities. Marx points out that the way that the capitalist will make a profit is by selling goods with that $100 of value add, but they will only pay their workers, say, $50 for all their time. And in this way, that's a steady process of transferring the results of the labor to somebody other than the laborer themselves. Young says that we can think beyond just work in a factory or the production and sale of commodities. She also points to a feminist idea, right? That women in heterosexual partnerships are often dependent on men. So we'll note that more women will be the stay-at-home parent, the dependent caregiver. And in that way, it makes it hard for them to leave the relationship. And it means that they are in a situation where they cannot always stand up for themselves or state their preferences because they know they are not in a position to actually say, I will leave the relationship if I do not get this or that or another benefit. Right? So there's this notion of dependency, but furthermore, Young is going to point out that in many heterosexual partnerships, women are not getting the same benefits that they get from men. So she even points out that there's less sexual satisfaction among women than men in many heterosexual partnerships. And that just goes to show that the way that expectations are set up in romantic partnerships is often with the male's concerns first. Right? But we would also think about it in terms of future opportunities or status. That oftentimes it's men who get praised for having a beautiful home even more than some of the women, or that having a large and beautiful family is something that men sometimes get more status and social recognition for. This is the idea that Young is gesturing towards in this feminist idea of seeing even heterosexual partnerships as exploitative. She also points to how there can be a notion of what she even calls hyper-exploitation when we think about race. Because not only is the work being underpaid given its labor, but there's also a way in which some kinds of menial labor, whether that be harvesting agricultural goods, or whether that be cleaning hotel rooms, or many sorts of menial service jobs. These will often be jobs that are racialized. There is a general cultural expectation that Black and Latinx people will perform these jobs. And in this way, we would notice that the work that these people do doesn't get them the benefits that the consumers of the labor or the purchasers of the labor will enjoy. So by staying at a fancy hotel, that may well enhance your status and well-being, but you're able to do this because of the labor of people doing menial labor, often racially coded menial labor. So that's our first phase of oppression, exploitation. We might think of it as situations where there's a steady process of getting benefits from others in a way that is not reciprocal. So that's our first phase of oppression. Our second phase of oppression, related but different, is marginalization. When a person is marginalized, Jung thinks, it is when they are treated as someone that the system of labor cannot or will not employ. So you may get the sense from the point about exploitation that to do certain kinds of jobs is to be avoided on this theory, but Jung will also note that doing work is part of what each human being often will want to do, and that it will enhance their lives in various ways. And she'll note that certain racially marked groups, immigrants, elderly people, disabled people, among others, will be treated as the sort of person whose labor is not valuable, that they cannot or will not be employed. Just thinking about disability, the way that many laws are written in this country, the United States of America, a person with a disability will lose their disability benefits if they end up having a full-time job or too much money, right? And in this way, disabled people are put into a double bind, right? They would lose their Medicaid funding for their wheelchair or their guide dog if they were to find full-time employment. But in this way, we marginalize that person, or we expect that elderly people can't contribute to the workplace. Well, in that case, that would marginalize them too. So one thing to note is that one benefit of being part of the labor force is that you will enjoy certain material resources, have some money, have access to certain opportunities. But a big opportunity that Jung wants to point out is that self-development is part of what you get to enjoy as somebody part of the labor force, right? You get to develop a skill and feel pride and self-worth in doing something productive. But when we marginalize people, when we exclude them from the main labor force, that robs them of that opportunity. So this is the second phase of oppression. You oppress somebody when you exclude them from production. And a third phase of oppression, closely related to marginalization, is what Jung calls powerlessness. She says that maybe the best way to understand powerlessness is to understand it in terms of what people lack. So what sort of power are we looking for? And she says we should think about it in terms of the status and power that professionals have in society. So think about the difference between having a summer job. I can think of some of the summer jobs that I've had, such as working at a golf course, or for a few summers I worked at a local campground, and it was my job to keep the grounds clean, take out the garbage, keep the bathrooms clean even. That's not a professional job, right? It's not a profession to take out the garbage and wash bathrooms, right? But we can also think about jobs that are professions, right? There we might think about jobs like nursing, or to be a teacher, or even to be, a skilled carpenter, right? And in these kinds of jobs, you are part of a class of people that you might call a professional, right? Why is it good to be a professional? Well, one thing that we might think of in terms of being a professional is that there is an expansive and progressive character of the work. So there's always progress in learning, So this is one of my favorite things about being a lecturer of philosophy, and I would consider this yet another example of a professional job, is I get to keep on learning and developing. One of the cool things about philosophy is that philosophy is never fully finished, right? Uh, and in that way, I will always be tweaking and adjusting the way that I design and teach my classes and work with students to help them be the best readers and critical thinkers and communicators about philosophy that they can be, right? So what's part of the value of a professional job is that there's this changing, there's moving, and there's also advancement within one's career. So, in my case, I may have opportunities to take leadership positions later in my career. And if you think about a person with even say like an education degree, they might start in the classroom and eventually become a vice principal or a principal, right? So you're growing your talents and there's opportunities to move up, right? We would also point out that there is day-to-day autonomy in one's work. Part of what's good about being a professional is that, say, once you're a lawyer or once you are a physician, you will have some control over how the schedule will be designed, especially if you have your own practice. And you will have your own judgment trusted in order to figure out what is best for your clients, what is best for your patients, and so forth. The last thing that Jung points out is social respectability, right? When people learn of me that I teach philosophy for a living, that I have a PhD, they acknowledge that position that I hold in society and my academic credentials with a certain kind of respect, right? And this is a thing that reasonably puts pride into the heart of a person, right? Now, in this case, we might say that when you are doing, say, janitorial work, you don't have those opportunities in the same way for advancement. You don't have the same kind of autonomy over your work. And oftentimes, you don't get any special social respect for holding a job that is considered working class. I gave the example of a carpenter before. We might think that maybe a carpenter would enjoy conditions A and B, and depending on who you ask, there might be varying levels of social respectability. Oftentimes, the high levels of social respectability are for people who have earned college degrees, right? But we'll notice here that these are benefits that a person can enjoy within society. And especially to be permanently without these opportunities, is a certain kind of oppression, right? You are part of an outsider non-privileged class rather than being part of the more privileged class of people within a labor force. Okay, so we've looked at exploitation, marginalization, and powerlessness. These are all, in certain ways, connected to work and labor, but Jung will also point out that beyond work and labor, we can also see oppression. So this fourth face of oppression is what Jung calls cultural imperialism. So if you are subject to cultural imperialism, it's to exist in a society with dominant meanings that render one's own perspectives invisible, and not only will you sometimes be invisible, but in other times you will be marked as other. So here, Jung would point out that this is true of immigrant communities and, say, African American communities, that the dominant meanings within those cultures are not necessarily the dominant meanings that are employed and understood within the whole culture. And we might also notice that within the black community, from rock and roll music to jazz music to rap music to other valuable forms of art like poetry, right? Oftentimes, when these meanings become part of the dominant culture, those meanings will also be, bringing in another aspect of oppression, they might be exploited by dominant cultures, right? So if we think about the fact that rock and roll music was developed and created through the creative energies of African American people, but was then popularized and definitely made rich people who were white. So in these cases, somebody like Elvis Presley is going to become rich and famous, whereas somebody like Howlin' Wolf or Muddy Waters will not become famous in the same way. So I think that we could see that this inability to see cultural meanings on their own terms is, spoken to in these examples of the way that, say, black culture is othered until it gets appropriated by white people, right? There's this interesting idea that when you are a victim of cultural imperialism, you will feel unseen. So your perspective on the world will be, in your view, obscure or not talked about in the cultural in general. But then you will also feel, when you are seen, that you're stigmatized through being seen with stereotypes. So we might think about the way in which gay and lesbian people have often felt like their experiences and their culture have not been properly understood or talked about or represented within our culture, within our literature and our film and our television. But also, when they are seen in film and culture and television, they are seen as other or shameful or weird or deviant. So not only black folks, not only LGBTQ folks, but this happens for indigenous people, that their ways of seeing the world are ignored, or when they are looked at, they are othered and belittled and exoticized, right? So these are examples of cultural imperialism. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the early leading thinkers in American Black thought, was one of the first black people to earn a PhD in the history of the United States. Captured this idea that to be part of a culturally marginalized group will leave you with a state of double consciousness, right? Because not only do you see the world through the lens of the culture in which you came through it, but you will also see yourself and the world through the eyes of a dominant culture, right? And in this way, this way in which a person has to see things through both ways can leave them mentally and emotionally exhausted or unsettled in their ways of seeing the world. So this is a fourth phase of oppression, beyond work, but it's about whether your experiences are represented and understood within a culture. Now, our fifth phase of oppression, perhaps the most concrete of them, is violence, right? So in cases of violence, we might think about how oppressed peoples will be subjected to fear of random, unprovoked attacks, right? So we may think about the ways in which black folks can be subjected to the violence of others through things like stand your ground laws or police practices that shoot first and ask questions later. Oftentimes we can think about people who are subjected to hate crimes. So we can think about LGBTQ people, Arab Americans or immigrant Arabs, black people. A sad story from this very week is that the governor of Pennsylvania, a Jewish person, suffered an arson attempt, and in fact on the first night of Passover, right? So we can think about these as like random, unprovoked threats to a person's material and bodily safety, right? Not only are we talking about threats of violence, but we can also think about verbal harassment. So when, say, a transgender person is just walking down the street and a person yells at them from their moving truck, we could think about that as a form of violence. A, because it's emotionally harmful, but B, because it leaves that person subject to fear that that person might do something more. Now, Young does note that some threats and some violence might be what she would call like tactical, that it is a calculated decision to keep a person down, to keep them fearful. She also points out that much violence that we notice and see in our culture is based on a certain kind of irrationality. The way that she's thinking about it here is that when a person acts violently, often they see others as a threat to their own identity, right? And this fearfulness and this feeling of threatenedness, even as a member of a dominant group, might lead a person to lash out at those who they perceive to be a threat. So I think like this sort of idea that there are, unconscious, irrational outbursts that are often part of this form of oppression can explain, for instance, many instances of violence against Black people or violence against transgender people. So that's our fifth face of oppression. Now, those are the 5 faces. So here are some conclusions that Young draws after giving these various analyses. Each of these 5 phases of oppression can help us to see and understand different ways in which a person might be oppressed. So what are we talking about when we talk about oppression? Young is going to say, well, we're talking about many possible things. And her 5 faces is basically her way of cashing out how, when we're talking about oppression, we're going to see any number of these aspects, whether it be exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, or violence, right? The way that we could think about it in philosophical terms is each face of oppression is a sufficient but not necessary condition for oppression. Just to think about it this way, we could think about different sufficient conditions for being a mammal. And one way of being a mammal is to be a dog. Another way of being a mammal is to be a human. Another way of being a mammal is to be a cat or a squirrel. We can see that you don't have to be a squirrel in order to be a mammal, but it's one way of being a mammal. In a similar way, we might think that violence is one way of oppressing and for others to be oppressed, but it's not the only way, because we will also need to understand other cases of oppression through something like cultural imperialism. He says, in this approach, no particular aspect is the truest or the primary notion of oppression. Rather, they are simply 5 distinct ways that are equally oppression and equally a problem and a barrier towards a just society. And she's going to point out what can be helpful about this is we can use it to understand different forms of oppression, right? So she gives the example of white people who are working class, and Young will admit white working class people are oppressed, right? She's going to say that white working class people are often exploited. They are not given enough value back for the labor that they produce. And in many ways, they suffer powerlessness because they don't have the sorts of opportunities and autonomy and status that professionals have. But especially when we're thinking about working class people, they are not exactly marginalized, right? They are not excluded from the system of labor. And in many cases, white working class people aren't threatened as a group with violence in the way that we would see people of color threatened. So in this way, Jung says that we can use these analyses to understand differences in levels of oppression, because maybe for black working class folks, they will suffer exploitation and powerlessness, but they also suffer from cultural imperialism and threats of violence in many cases. And there might be cases where, for a particular person, all five faces will apply. They will be exploited, marginalized, powerlessness, be victims of cultural imperialism and violence. I think that the other thing that can be useful about Jung's paper, and part of why I assigned this paper and developed this lecture, is that it helps us to go deeper on one of the claims that we find in Anderson. Once we start thinking about a just society more expansively, we're not just going to be thinking about who gets what material goods, and we will also point out that not every single dissatisfaction with society amounts to oppression. So Elizabeth Anderson's point is that we could imagine a person who thinks that their life would be so much better if the government would provide them with the universal basic income that would allow them to just live cheap, smoke weed, and surf, right? But we might think that if the government and if society decides that they will not provide you with the resources to do no work, smoke weed, and surf, that doesn't really seem like a good example of any of these five faces of oppression. And in this way, we can also point out that not every personal dissatisfaction will amount to oppression. But I hope that this has been an illuminating look at Jung's analysis of oppression, and that it gives you perhaps a useful lens, and maybe a set of 5 lenses for making sense of what's going right and what's going wrong in our world today. So thanks for listening in. Take care. And as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thanks.